Picture this. You've done some work. You've read the book. You've been in therapy. You've had the insight. You understand your patterns. You understand the dance. And you decide this time, I'm going to do it differently. This time, I'm not going to go quiet, or this time, I'm not going to escalate. I'm going to hold my ground and speak from a calm, clear place. And then the other person in the dance of anger with you completely loses it. Or maybe they shut down, or they tell you that you've changed and not in a complimentary way. Or maybe they ramp up the very behavior that you were trying to address until the pressure to go back to your old steps becomes almost unbearable. And part of you thinks, maybe I should just go back to how things were. At least then things were predictable. And if this all sounds familiar, then this episode is for you, because today we are talking about what happens when you try to change your steps in the dance of anger, and why the resistance that you are getting is not a sign that you are wrong. It is actually a sign that something real is shifting. So let's just jump right in to today's episode.
Welcome to Reclaiming Me, a trauma-informed podcast helping women with complex PTSD heal the lasting impact of childhood attachment wounds from parents and caregivers, so you can finally release people-pleasing and perfectionism and learn to trust in relationships, beginning with the one you have with yourself. I'm your host, Cindy Payne, therapist, trauma specialist, and a woman who has walked this path both personally and professionally.
Welcome back, everybody. It is so good to be here on another full-length episode of Reclaiming Me. And today I want to get personal again right from the start, because I think it makes everything that we are about to talk about more real. And the dance in my own marriage has been one of the most clarifying and humbling things that I've ever experienced as both a person and a clinician. And I say that having sat through hundreds of sessions with clients in their own relational dances with anger over the years. So for most of our marriage, my dance looked like this. My husband traveled. I held everything down at home. And rather than naming clearly and early, that's key, what I needed, rather than holding a boundary around a joint decision-making piece or a shared load of something, I just absorbed it, because that is what I learned to do early on in my childhood, because as a CPTSD survivor, I was not taught that my needs were worth disrupting the peace for. And the tricky thing about this pattern is that it doesn't look like dysfunction from the outside. It looks like a capable woman holding things together. It looks like a devoted mother. It looks like someone who has handled it. And what it actually is, for me anyway, is a nervous system that learned a very long time ago that expressing needs came with risk, that keeping the peace was safer than rocking the boat, that absorbing was preferable to confronting. And so I absorbed for years while building resentment that I did not always have words for, but oftentimes I did have words for, and they weren't always pleasant. So when I look back at the trip that I talked about in last week's full-length episode, so it was a 17-day stint for me that started in Italy, picking up my oldest from his study abroad program and meeting the rest of the family in Greece, and then sending the kids on their way and celebrating the last few days in Budapest with my husband. What I see most clearly is how many moments that there were where my overfunctioning showed up again right before I even registered it as a choice. And it feels a little embarrassing to be talking about this at this stage in the game, being that I speak on this for a living and work with clients. But as I've always said, if you were a fly on the wall in some moments of my marriage and child rearing days, you might never step foot in my office. That is me just being totally transparent and totally human. And again, just a little side note, this is something that we had planned for and saved for and worked for. And so the expectations were even higher. But let's back up because it was my decision to fly early to meet my son. And we had grand plans to go on this hiking trip, and he got sick. And so I ended up just trying to navigate my way to him through 3 cities in 4 days in record heat in a country that does not have the capacity to cool off that many people. And I did all this in the name of wanting to connect with him originally and spend time. And I really did. That was my intention. But I also think, I know, I'm outing myself here, that there was a part of me that had some anxiety about him finishing up his program and getting on an airplane to meet the rest of the crew in Athens. And I needed to manage the logistics when things fell apart. And that was me future tripping and overfunctioning and holding the emotional container like I have always done for a family that, again, as I said in last episode, was already all running on empty, and planning the entire 17-day itinerary for myself and anticipating everyone's needs. And the thing I kept coming back to is this: my son got himself initially to Rome, where this whole thing started. He was capable. He kept up with his passport the entire time, and they took little side trips, that I was finding out about along the way. And he's an adult now who's been navigating things independently for a couple of years now. And I was already there, already in motion, already making sure, not because he asked me to, but because stepping in before someone else has room to ask is so automatic for me that I didn't even recognize it as a pattern until I was sitting with it afterwards. And that's what long-term overfunctioning does. It stops feeling like a choice, and it just feels like who you are. And it feels like this is what love requires. This is the responsible thing to do as a mother. And then you land back home after 17 days and you're exhausted in a way that sleep doesn't fix, because the exhaustion isn't just physical. It's the weight of having been the one who held it together again, the one who pivoted again, the one who managed again, while also carrying the grief of a 25th anniversary that didn't feel the whole time the way you needed it to feel. And partly because of what happened, and partly because you arrived to it already so damn depleted from everything that came before. And you also have a childhood conditioning that told you that you were never allowed to complain in the face of something that was supposed to be celebratory, because that makes you ungrateful. So that's my shame stuff. And somewhere in all of this, the anger that you've been absorbing for months, honestly longer than that for me, finds cracks, and it comes through in the most inopportune times. But as I always say here on this podcast, this is not weakness. It is not failure. And it is a nervous system that's been doing too much again for too long, finally sending up a flare. And I want you to know that even as a therapist, even knowing all of this, I am still in this. We are still in this. And I personally think that there's something important about saying that out loud, because I don't know about you, but I hate reading books and listening to podcasts where people presume that they have it all figured out. I would just rather not. So I want to introduce what we're going to be covering today in this second part of the anger series. And that's number one, that every relationship has a dance, and every dance has rules, even when nobody ever said them out loud. And number two, when you change your steps, the system will work hard to pull you back in. And that is not personal. That is just how systems work. And finally, number three, that staying the course through the pushback and what Harriet Lerner calls holding on to yourself, that is the actual work of change. So let's just jump right in to takeaway one. Every relationship has a dance. I love this idea of it being a dance because for me, it hasn't always felt like a dance. Harriet Lerner's central metaphor in the dance of anger, to me, it's brilliant in its simplicity. She talks about how every relationship, every family system, every significant dynamic that we are part of has a dance, a pattern of moves and counter moves that both people have learned to do so automatically that they don't even realize they're doing it. So you pursue and they withdraw. You withdraw and they pursue. You go quiet, they escalate. You apologize, they soften. You push back, they shut down. And these dances develop over time. They are shaped by our own attachment histories, our own family of origin dynamics, our own nervous systems, and honestly, by what worked for you at some point, even if it stopped working a long time ago. And here's the thing about dances. Both people are doing them. It's not that one person is the problem and one person is the victim. Let me be very clear about that. Both people are participating in this pattern, usually without conscious awareness. Usually because the pattern, as dysfunctional as it might be, is familiar. And familiarity feels safe to a nervous system that learned early that unpredictability equals danger. So the first step in changing the dance is recognizing that you're in one. And most importantly, not blaming yourself for it, not blaming the other person guilty, just seeing it clearly that this is a pattern. This is how we move in relationship together. And I want something different now. So when we realize we want something different now, the system will pull you back in. And probably not intentionally or on purpose or out of a place of vengeance, but every system, every relationship, every family has a homeostatic pull, a tendency to return to its familiar state. So when things are in balance, even a very painful balance, the system works to maintain that balance. It's not conscious most of the time. It's not malicious. It's just how systems function. So when you start changing your steps, so for me, when I stop overfunctioning, or for someone else, when you stop apologizing for things that aren't your fault, when you hold a boundary instead of caving, when you stay calm instead of escalating, the system registers that as destabilizing and it responds by pushing back hard. And so the pushback, let's talk about what that can look like, because it can look like a lot of different things. The other person might get louder or more insistent, or they might accuse you of being cold or distant or selfish. And I see this a lot with boundary setting. If you formally haven't really voiced your boundaries, they might suddenly develop a crisis that requires your immediate attention. They might tell you that therapy has made you worse. They might give you the silent treatment. They might escalate the exact behavior that you were trying to address. And if you have read or you're planning on reading The Dance of Anger, you'll learn that Dr. Lerner describes this so brilliantly. She talks about how the people in our lives become so accustomed to our old steps that when we change them, it feels very threatening. So not because they consciously want to control us, though sometimes that could be part of it, but because our change requires them to change too. And that is uncomfortable for anybody. And for those of us with complex trauma histories, this pushback can be particularly activating because our nervous systems have learned to read conflict as danger. And when someone we love pushes back hard, everything in us wants to regulate that threat by going back to what worked before, by apologizing maybe, or softening, or becoming smaller again. And this is the moment. This is the exact moment where the work either deepens or it just dissolves. And here's where the bitch of the accommodator framing comes back in, because when the pushback comes, we are being handed those same two old choices. And if you listened to last week's episode, you'll remember that it was being the bitch or being the nice girl or the accommodator. So explode and confirm the bitch narrative, or cave and go back to accommodating and being nice. Lerner's third way is the hard one. And that is to hold your position. Stay in the conversation. Speak from your own experience. Don't attack, don't collapse, but just stay. This is also where the overfunctioning and underfunctioning piece matters so much. So Lerner says that overfunctioners have often this tendency to make the first move in changing the dance, not because it's fair, right? So if you're an overfunctioner and you're thinking, shit, like I have to now initiate the change too, that's hard, but because they're most likely the ones in the most pain. They're the ones whose resentment becomes unsustainable. They're the ones who have the most to gain from something shifting. And the first move for an overfunctioner is almost the hardest thing imaginable because it requires you stopping. It requires you stepping back and letting something go undone or done imperfectly by somebody else. And then the second part of that is tolerating the anxiety of not controlling the outcome and trusting, even when your nervous system is screaming otherwise, that the other person can step up if you create that space for them to do so. And I want to say something honest here about what this looks like in a long marriage, because when you've been in a dance for 25 years, the pullback to familiar steps is incredibly strong because you know exactly how this goes. If you just do the old move, you know how the night ends, you know what the morning is going to look like. And even if it's not what you want, it's what you know. And what you know feels survivable in a way that unknown doesn't, especially when your nervous system was shaped by early experiences where the unknown felt genuinely dangerous. And when I think about this for me personally, in my own long relationship, I've been married for 25 years, but we've been together for 30 since the age of 17. And so we were entering this relationship as I was leaving what Lerner calls my first family and stepping into this second family. So I had no idea, right? So just a little nugget there. And then finally, takeaway 3, holding on to yourself through the pushback. So Harriet Lerner talks about something she calls staying on your own side. And I love that wording. So holding on to yourself means maintaining your position, not rigidly, not defensively. And this is hard at first, but clearly and calmly. So even when the pressure to abandon it is enormous. And this is differentiation in action. So the capacity to stay connected to your own values, your own perspective, your own sense of self while remaining in the relationship with somebody who sees things differently without either fusing or losing yourself in the other person's reality or cutting off or shutting down and going away. And I want to be honest with you about what this actually feels like in practice because it does not feel like strength. At least for me, it did not at first. For me, it felt more like sitting in a fire. It felt like tolerating just a huge amount of discomfort that my nervous system was screaming at me to relieve. It felt lonely and scary and uncertain. And that's okay because I know now that that's what growth actually feels like from the inside. And what helps is knowing in advance that the pushback is coming. So Lerner talks about this too. When you decide to change your steps, you can almost always predict the resistance. And when you can predict it, then you can prepare for it. And you can remind yourself, this is the system doing what systems do. This is not evidence that I'm wrong. This is evidence that something is actually changing. And what also helps is having support outside of the relationship. So finding a really good therapist, a trusted friend, a community of people who understand this work, because trying to hold on to yourself in the middle of a heated relational dance while also being your only source of grounding is incredibly hard. And there's just, in my opinion, too much history between you and the other person if it's like a long relationship to rely on that other person to understand that and get that right away. That's just not how it works. I mean, we teach each other this dance. And I think what helps most of all is connecting back to why you started changing your steps in the first place. So, really asking yourself, what do you want your relationships to look like? What do you want to model? What does the version of you on the other side of this look like? And see if you can really hold on to that, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. I think, after being home and reflecting on this trip, I think for me, why this is so crucial at this point in my life is that I'm not going to be needed as a mother in the same way that I've been needed for the last 20 years. And I know, and I've seen it in action, that all too often when the kids leave the nest, we can sometimes expect our partner to fill that hole. And what ends up happening is we begin to resent the person even more because that's not a fair ask of that other person. So we need to be able to return to the self and work on creating a more whole self than relying on our partner or other person in our life to fulfill that need. So I think that was the urgency for me personally. So as we wrap on Wednesday, our midweek reframe, I'm going to be giving you a concrete tool for staying grounded when the pushback feels like too much. So it's a way to hold on to yourself in real time when the pull to go back to your old steps is feeling really strong. So if you're sitting here thinking like of a person in mind that you want to try this out with, but you're already feeling a little scared that you're going to get blowback, I really encourage you to tune in on Wednesday. And I think you'll find that to be really useful. And next week, in Monday's full-length episode, we're going to be moving into the forgiveness series. And I have to just give you a little heads up that this one is close to my heart because forgiveness is, I think, one of the most misunderstood concepts in healing. And Harriet Lerner has things to say about that too in another book that she wrote called Why Won't You Apologize? That I think is going to surprise you. So if you have a question about complex PTSD and you would like for me to answer it on the podcast, please know that I am still taking listener questions for a couple more weeks for a 2-part Ask Me Anything episode. And all of my contact information is in the show notes. And just a quick side note, if you contact me directly through my website and you don't hear back from me in a timely manner, try my email address just directly from your email address because I have had some issues in getting the response sent back out. So you can also find me on Instagram at Cindy Payne Rooted and DM me directly. So please finally take a moment to review and rate the podcast wherever you listen. It means more than you know, and it reaches people and helps people heal. So until Wednesday, take good care of yourself. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for spending this time with me today. I hope you leave feeling a little lighter, a little more grounded, and a little closer to trusting yourself and your inner experience. If this episode resonated with you, please follow or subscribe so future conversations can meet you when they're needed. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, consider sharing this episode with them. That's one of the ways this work reaches the people who need it the most. You can find me on Instagram at Cindy Payne Rooted, and you can also visit me at cindypayne.com, where you'll find all episode links, blog posts, practice updates, and a free people-pleasing style quiz designed to help you notice your patterns with more compassion. And remember, every small step towards healing, self-trust, and presence matters. You are worthy of this journey. Thanks, everyone.